C-Suite, we're now being joined by Ritu Verma of Ankur Capital. Ritu, thank you so much for joining us here in the C-Suite. Talk to us about funding startups in an environment like this, in a post-pandemic world. If we were having this conversation about startups and the startup boom in this country 3-4 years ago, it would have been very different. But in the last couple of years, we've seen mixed feelings emerge about startups. There was the euphoria around unicorns, and India does have over 100 unicorns at this stage. But then we've also seen startups that scaled up in the blink of an eye and then had to scale down or completely exit the business in the blink of an eye, hiring thousands of people quickly and hiring and firing thousands quickly. We've seen all this happen with startups recently. Tell us, how do you approach a startup when you want to pump money into it in this context?
So I can say that, I know this is the narrative that is going around, but you have to recognize what was happening in the last 2-3 years and what's happening now. And from our perspective, nothing's changed, right? We're a long-term investor. We're not a short-term investor, right? Yeah, things sound very great when lots of money gets dumped and all of that stuff happens, and it sounds terrible when everybody sort of gets fired. So it was a question of overeating. Right? So at some point you have to shed that weight, right? Essentially, for what's right for you at the end of it. So I think if you take the long-term view, which is what we take, I don't think us looking at a startup today or what we did 3 years is any different, right? Because we're in a long-term view, markets have cycles, capital is cheap, people will dump capital. But at the core of it, you have to build a business, right? You have to, find a solution, a disruptive solution that scales, that people want to pay for, right? Because that's the ultimate game. So it's an aberration that we've had, right? It helps fuel things, right? But you've got to be cognizant it can't fuel things forever, and you have to focus on it. And I think the tsunami of money got people to focus not on the core, and so now you're seeing the ones that didn't focus on the core actually have to shed.
I'm asking this question because you've had the Ashneer Grover incident in the startup world, when again are these startup founders getting too big for their boots? What about their corporate governance culture in startups, how they treat employees in startups, how they treat clients in startups. So many questions being raised, and all of this played out in full public view. How did you see all of that?
No, I think it's a sign of excess, primarily, right? Because you need time, you need focus to be getting these things right? Long-term companies build governance, build culture, employee management, HR, those things are people generated, people's, values also, right? And when you all of a sudden take in all of this money and all your focus is on that growth top line number, and you're not worried about keeping the house in order or getting the house geared up to scale, you run into these issues. So to me, it's just a function of that.
Are startups
have bad apples? But I think a lot of it, perhaps, you have to differentiate between bad apples and people who just, went crazy, not paying any attention to any of this, right? So I think you'll have both sets, and that's not good.
If I were to ask you simply, are startups scaling up too fast for their own good in today's environment?
Sometimes, yes, right? So I don't think there's anything wrong with scaling up, as long as you know the levers, right, that you're using to drive that scale up. So once you don't know what those levers are, then you're in a mess when the cash is not there. But if you have the levers, right, you know when to push those buttons and say, okay, I can't spend on this, I stop this, and this is how it will go if I stop this, but I know what it gave me, right? So I think that's the critical thing. I don't think there's anything wrong with scaling up fast, as long as you know what you're doing. And as long as you know what button you're pushing there for that.
I'm asking this because, when a startup founder comes and pitches their idea, their business to you, what are the things that you're looking for, or what are the things that are red flags for you, that will stop you from investing in that company?
So you're asking me if it's a very attractive idea and we love the idea, what would stop us from putting in investment?
That too.
Look, for all of us, we have theses, etc., that we're investing behind. So, things have to fall into that bucket. We do look outside that bucket because, part of entrepreneurship is about the future, and you have people thinking beyond what you can think, which is the whole game in many respects. So I think that's one aspect. But let's say we passed all those hurdles. So typically, I think it's the team at some level, and that's where the interactions sort of come in and say, just is this a fit or is this not a fit for us, right? The journey that you want to go on, is this the journey that we believe in, and do we believe that you're the right person to take that journey? So a lot of that's where some of the red flags sort of come up. And we've obviously been down investments and unearthed things and said, okay, look, there's no way we can go here. So there's a bunch of this type of stuff that does come up. So
I'm asking this question because the show is called the C-Suite, and your decision decides whether somebody becomes a CEO or a CTO etc. Your decision makes somebody a CEO. So you're essentially picking out a CEO from a pitch. In that sense, that's why I was asking this question.
That's the fundamental challenge, right? And that's why I said the team makes difference, right? So I think a CEO of a very young startup with a CEO at a growth startup versus a CEO at a much more mature company, CEO at a listed company are different roles, right? I think we have this expectation that somebody does that entire journey, right? And so you're asking a person to evolve, you're asking a person to sort of learn along the way. What does it take to be a CEO of a 1,000-person organization? What does it take to be a CEO of a 10,000-person? The questions that you asked earlier, right? So I think they're different roles, and entrepreneurs that recognize that you can transition to different roles make the journey. But if you don't, then that's a problem, right? Because it's not the same job, It's just called the same, but it's not the same job.
Do you think that there is now a funding crunch, or in some places they say India's startup ecosystem is entering a funding winter, so to speak? Do you think that is a reality, or do you think that's a hyperbole? And if it is a reality, what is causing it? What is the way forward for startups to raise money?
See, I think it's a question of contrast, right? So we were at such a high that you're calling this a winter. Right? If I come up with a very AC room and I walk out and say, "Bahut garmi hai bahar mein," so it's kind of like that, right? I think the money is still there. I think the opportunities are still there. It's just not flowing at the same rate. But that doesn't mean that there isn't capital, right? There is capital. Capital got more expensive, hence the flow rate has slowed, and it is asking for more discipline, is what it's asking for. So I would hesitate to call it a winter. Yeah, just because it's pouring doesn't mean it's not raining, right? So that's roughly how I would look at it.
All right, we will leave it at that. Ritu, thank you so much for joining us here in the C-Suite on News 9 Plus. It was a pleasure talking to you. Hope we talk to you again.
Thanks, Krishna.